The American Civil War is a dark chapter in United States history and undoubtedly the most painful experience for Americans. However, this war had a far greater impact on American society and politics than any other event in the nation's history. The war resulted in the abolition of the hateful institution of slavery. Americans truly became a unified nation, and the United States emerged as the world's most powerful economy and most advanced democracy. At least 620,000 people lost their lives in the American Civil War, which was 2% of the country's population in 1861. If 2% of the American population were to die in a war today, that number would exceed 6.7 million. That's how bloody and horrific the American Civil War was, unprecedented in the Western world. But how did such a terrifying war begin? Why did Americans fight each other with such ferocity? Let's try to understand it from the beginning. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, was the direct result of another war that occurred 15 years earlier, the American-Mexican War from 1846 to 1848. The question of whether slavery would be allowed in the approximately 700,000 square miles of Mexican territory that came under U.S. control after that war deeply divided Americans. This led to over a decade of heated political debate, which ultimately escalated into a civil war. Slavery in the United States began in early 1619, when a Portuguese ship brought at least 20 enslaved Africans to present-day Virginia. From that year onward, slavery spread throughout America. During the War of Independence from Britain from 1775 to 1783, slavery was legal in all 13 British colonies in America. At the beginning of the 19th century, states in the northern United States gradually began to abolish slavery. However, the economies of the southern states were built on the foundation of slavery. At that time, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the southern states. By the mid-19th century, the United States had achieved considerable economic prosperity, but there was a fundamental economic difference between the country's northern and southern regions. The northern economy was primarily based on industry and factories, and most of its agricultural production was limited to small-scale farms. In contrast, the southern economy relied on large-scale plantation agriculture. The main driving force behind the large agricultural plantations there was the inhuman labor of enslaved black people. The main cash crops of the South were cotton and tobacco. Enslaved black people were worked to the bone on these plantations. After 1830, demands for the abolition of slavery grew strong in the industrial-based states of the North. Following the Mexican War, Northern opposition to extending slavery into new territories made the Southern states fearful. They believed that if slavery were abolished, their slave labor-based economy would collapse. Disagreements over the future of slavery between the North and South gradually intensified. White people in the South believed that slavery must be extended to new territories, otherwise it would gradually die out. In 1845, they pressured the federal government to annex Texas. They even supported efforts to purchase Cuba and join it to the United States as a slave state. On the other hand, residents of the northern states opposed the extension of slavery into new territories and gradually built public opinion in favor of freeing the enslaved. In the mid-1850s, this disagreement between North and South reached its peak. After the publication of a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, residents of the northern states became even more anti-slavery. The novel depicted the cruel abuse and injustice suffered by an enslaved black man, which deeply touched people's hearts. However, pro-slavery lawmakers pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through the U.S. Congress in 1854. This act declared slavery legal even in new territories. In opposition to this act, a new political party called the Republican Party was formed in the northern states. The first president from this party was Abraham Lincoln. In the midst of this intense disagreement over slavery, the historic U.S. presidential election was held in 2060. Abraham Lincoln took office as the first Republican president of the United States. The Republican Party came to power primarily by promising to abolish slavery. As a result, as soon as Abraham Lincoln became president, citizens of the southern states became enraged. Just 2 months after the presidential election, the state of South Carolina announced its secession from the United States. Subsequently, one by one, all the southern states seceded from the Union, united against the North, and formed a separate confederacy. One of the founders of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. The southern states declared that statement in the Declaration of Independence to be false and announced they would fight to preserve slavery. They characterized slavery as their greatest material and worldly interest. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens declared that black people could never be equal to white people. The slavery of an inferior race to a superior race was a natural and normal matter. In response, President Abraham Lincoln pledged to realize the promise of the Declaration of Independence and preserve the U.S. Constitution. Consequently, on April 12, 1861, the historic American Civil War began, an unprecedented bloody civil war in the Western world. The war ended 4 years later on April 9, 1865, but in a twist of cruel fate, the war's supreme commander, President Abraham Lincoln, did not live to see the fruits of his labor. Just 5 days after the surrender of the combined forces of the southern states, on the evening of April 14th, he was assassinated and died on April 15th. He left behind, through this civil war, the resolution of 2 unresolved, fundamental, and troubling questions and problems embedded in the American founding and Constitution. The first question was whether the world's first large democratic republic, born in an era of monarchy, autocracy, and aristocratic rule worldwide, would survive. After beginning the war for independence from Britain, America declared itself a republic or democratic nation in 1776. America was the world's first large-scale modern democratic state, but even the founders of this nation were doubtful about its chances of survival, because they had seen that all the democracies that had existed in history before and during their time had been overthrown by counter-revolutions or had descended into anarchy or dictatorship. Even in 1860, many living Americans had seen the French Republic, born from the French Revolution, surrender to active forces at least twice. They feared the same fate might await them. Therefore, Abraham Lincoln described the American Civil War as a great test of whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people, would endure or perish from the earth. Ultimately, the victory of the northern states under his leadership in the American Civil War ensured the survival of the world's first large democratic republic created in 1776. Abraham Lincoln also spoke of a new birth of freedom. With this phrase, he referred to another unresolved problem since the American Revolution of 1776, slavery. The American Civil War solved that problem too. Americans liked to proudly say that their land of liberty served as a beacon of freedom for oppressed peoples around the world. But there was darkness beneath that beacon's light. As Abraham Lincoln said in 1854, the monstrous injustice of slavery deprives our republic of the opportunity to influence the world justly and gives enemies of liberty a reasonable opportunity to mock us as hypocrites. Finally, after the Civil War, that terrible injustice was ended through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Before the American Civil War, 2 different socio-economic and cultural systems were competing for dominance in U.S. politics: a slave labor-based agrarian society versus a free labor-based entrepreneurial capitalist society. Although the victory of free labor-based capitalism seems inevitable in hindsight, it was by no means clear at the time, because the rural, agricultural, and plantation-based social institutions and ideologies of the South, complete with racial division and the harsh system of slave labor, dominated the U.S. government for most of that period. In fact, the Southern states were more aggressive than the Northern states in territorial expansion. If the Southern states had won the American Civil War, the United States might not have emerged as the world's most powerful economy and most advanced democracy. After the victory of the Northern states in the Civil War, the ideals and institutions of free labor-based entrepreneurial capitalism began to dominate across all of America. It can even be said that this Civil War created modern America.
As Mark Twain said in 1873, the catastrophe of the American Civil War uprooted century-old institutions, brought a change in the politics of entire populations, and affected the entire national character so profoundly that its consequences cannot be measured in 2 or 3 generations. At least 5 generations will be needed to measure the consequences of that Civil War's catastrophe. Twain was indeed correct. After the war, the national unity achieved by the United States took generations to solidify.